Welcome back, everyone. And now we have arrived at the final highlights of today's program, presented by Delinea. This session is titled Inside the Mind of a Hacker, Unveiling the Risks of Identity-Based Cyber Attacks. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Joseph Carson, Chief Security Scientist and Advisory CISO at Delinea.
Well, hello everyone. I have the hardest session of the day. It's always the last one before you get to leave here and go home. But I hope that you will enjoy this. When I was thinking about this session and going through inside the mind of a hacker, and I myself am a hacker. I'm one of the ethical hackers, the good hackers that try to identify things before the bad things happen. Or when bad things happen, I help organizations recover. So my role at Delinea is the Chief Security Scientist, so I do a lot of research. And Delinea is a company that focuses around identity and privilege security. So when I was thinking about how to show you about the risks of identity-based cyber attacks, and I was thinking about there's different ways that I could share this with you, but I thought the best option is to actually take you through a real scenario, a real world incident of a ransomware attack. And every step along the way to show you all the areas where the attackers target identities, how they circumvented the security, how they compromised them, how they elevated privileges, and ultimately to the end, where they actually deployed a really nasty ransomware and brought a business to entire standstill. So I thought to take you through that journey, at the beginning, I'm going to provide you a little bit of context, and then we're going to get into the hacker mindset, and we're going to take you through the hackers' capabilities and the techniques that they use in order to gain access and steal data and deploy ransomware. So let's get into it. So this session itself, so the ransomware variant itself is Krylock. And I always like talking about Krylock, because Krylock, there was version .2, there's version .3, and the initial version was Kryackle. What I like talking about this particular one is it was one of the earlier ransomware as a service. It was actually one of the first variants of ransomware that the creators created, but they were not the same people that actually deploy it. They make it as an affiliate program. So they share it with others, basically to get the royalties back from their victims. So it's almost like a channel partner program that they actually have, and they get their channel to deploy it, and they receive rewards from the victims that they gather they actually ransom demands from. Now, if you look at this, the particular organization that was the victim of this particular ransomware case was a very large transportation organization. And all of a sudden, they're now faced with looking at all of the systems and seeing this, and all of the servers, desktops, and employees couldn't do their job, and they were faced with a ransom demand. So let me take you through and show you from the context of the actual organization first. So when organizations find out they're a victim of a ransomware attack, what they find out from the outside. Sometimes it's law enforcement will find out that they're actually from basically evidence gathering or investigating other incidents. They might find evidence of their data combined in the command and control servers. Sometimes it's from third parties, including customers. They might be trying to access the service of the organization, all of a sudden that service is unavailable. You might find that the attackers contact you, and in this particular incident, the attackers contacted the IT team directly. Because of course, what did they have access to? Everything. They had access to the actually IT department's home address, contact telephone numbers, resumes, job descriptions. They had access to all of their personal details, and they were contacting them directly at their homes when the incident occurred, because it was early Sunday morning when the attackers contacted the IT team. So that's a very common method, because the attackers want you to react fast. They want you to start dealing with it because they want to get the ransom payment as early and quickly as possible. Sometimes you find out from social media. Sometimes the attackers want to brag about it. They want to tell the world and show their capabilities. Sometimes it's from the employees. The employees try to log into a system, or all of a sudden they log in and they see a pop-up box that the ransom demand, and therefore they find out. In other scenarios, sometimes you find out from security researchers. Now, as I was brought in to help this organization, I was brought in as an identity expert and an ethical hacker to help them find out the attack path. How did the attackers get in? How did they move around? How did they exploit identities? And ultimately find out the ultimate attack path itself. So as I started investigating this, one of the interesting things that I found during the initial investigation was that I found evidence of another victim. So I'm looking at the logs, I'm looking at the evidence, and all of a sudden I start finding domain names, usernames, passwords, IP addresses of another organization within the actually logs of this particular victim. So I contacted the owners, the executives, the board, I contacted the legal team and law enforcement, and I said, hey, I found evidence of another victim. Do you mind if I contacted them? Maybe we can collaborate, share indicators of compromise, share lessons learned. And they said, yes, go ahead. Make sure you do it all in official, make sure you kind of keep the information at as minimum as possible. So I contacted this other organization of the logs and data I'm looking at. And I reached out and I looked at their website and I found out the information for the security team, and I contacted them and said, hey, I'm working on this other victim who's a ransomware victim. I found evidence that you're a victim also. Do you want to share lessons learned? Maybe we can share basically, compromise or indicators, the logs, the variants, and so forth. And they responded. They came back very quickly and said, no, we weren't a victim. And I'm thinking, that's weird because I'm looking at your data. This is your domain name. This is your usernames and server names. And I responded back again. I said, hey, maybe they haven't deployed the ransomware yet. Maybe this is a case where we can actually stop it before it even happens. And at that point in time, it went quiet. Months later, about 2 months later, after I was wrapping up this particular incident, I said I had to hand over the evidence gathering, the digital forensics that I gathered to law enforcement, to legal team for legal law cases. And what I ended up doing, I said, one final attempt. I'll reach out to this organization. I'll just say, just to let you know, I finished the case. I'm handing it over. You might be contacted by law enforcement later. And immediately they responded and said, yes, you're absolutely right. We were a victim. We paid the ransomware, and we didn't want anyone to know. And it's really amazing when you go through these investigations that you find so many other incidents and victims from single cases. So this organization, they're now a victim of ransomware. It's been deployed, and now they're faced with a situation where they've got an active attacker on their network, and they're faced with a really harsh decision. They're faced with a decision whether do they pull the plug, because data is basically exiting the organization. Gigabytes of data is basically been uploaded to command and controls, to FTP sites on the internet, and the data is actually leaving the organization. And they were worried that if they don't shut down the systems, they could lose their entire data set, their ERP system, their customer information, their financial information. They were also faced with, well, these systems are now unavailable. Can they go back to manual? What systems were still available and operational? What could they still perform as a business? And the attackers are still on the system. So they actually made the very hard decision that they actually shut everything down. They actually had to stop the data from leaving the organization because that was seen as more severe than actually the damage that was caused at the time. So they actually unplugged their systems, they took it all offline, and then started to evaluate the situation of the environment. So the next thing is that, okay, now they're a victim. What's the decisions that we have to make for them to recover? So the first thing is an incident responder coming in. You're like, okay, let's go and restore from the backup. Unfortunately, the backup is also encrypted. So they had a flat network, same credentials, and that backup was mostly focused at actually resiliency. It was mostly focused at hardware failure, data resiliency, data recovery, and therefore the backup itself was on a flat network and therefore easily accessible from the attackers as well. And the interesting thing is, what do we call all of our servers? You know, the SQL server, the web server, the backup server. So it was very easy visible for the attackers to see which server was where the backup was because it was very easily named. So they were in the next situation about, well, we don't have a backup to recover to. Let's consider paying the ransom. So that's when the financial officer, the CEO, all started looking at what is their options of paying the ransom. And this particular ransom demand was 10 million euros, and that's at the 50% discount of the 2 days. 10 million euros. They're faced with this ransom demand. And the attackers are going, you know, this is your fault. You're the ones that actually let this happen. You're the criminals here. I'm just helping you show that this is actually an incident that I'm going to save you in the future. So they're trying to be the hero. The attackers are trying to show that they're doing a good thing. This is a service they're providing. So this organization started considering paying the ransom. And I was given the task, is there an alternative option for them to recover? Is there any other way that they can get their business back without having to pay the ransom? Or actually in this third option, just to start from scratch? And there's also the fourth option, which is not here, which is sometimes you can actually find law enforcement might take down a command and control, they might find the keys, security researchers might find vulnerabilities and allow you to recover that way. So sometimes that does happen. It doesn't happen often. It did happen with Crackle version 1.6, but not with Krylock. So they were now faced with alternative options. So I'm in a situation where I'm coming in and I want to understand what is the attack path? How did the attackers gain access? What did they have access to? Did they have access to domain administrators? Yes, they did. They had access to the full domain administrator account and access to everything in the network, all systems, all the data, all the applications. In this environment, it was limited to just the on-premise environment. The attackers had not yet elevated and escalated to the cloud environment, so that was actually maintained and still accessible. How long was this going on for? So I used tools like Log2Timeline, Plasso, and gathering events and trying to basically work my way back. And I was given the permission to go back up to 5 years and to try and understand about all the evidence and everything that happened over a 5-year period. And in this incident, we found out the initial attack happened 7 months prior to the ransom deployment. 7 months prior, there was an initial access that happened, a one-time successful logon from a known Tor exit node VPN that basically was once successful, and that was it. 3 months later, same thing happened. 2 weeks before the actually ransom attack, same thing happened, and then it was hands-on keyboard after that. So this had been going on for 7 months, and we started having to pull together all the times and trying to understand exactly what was happening. So the other thing as well, it was interesting again, when I'm investigating these types of incidents, I did find that 2 years before, somebody had deployed a crypto mining software on one of the servers. And it ended up being an employee of the organization decided that let's make a little bit of money on the side by using the company resources to mine cryptocurrency. So of course, you tend to find evidence of other things that shouldn't be there, and you hand that over to the business and they can decide what they want to do. It was really interesting because it was costing that business tens of thousands of euros in energy costs because those servers are running at high performance, mining cryptocurrency, and that employee was benefiting from it. But that was some things that you find during these types of investigation. Also, what tools did they use? You want to understand the tools and techniques. Did they leave backdoors so that if you actually mitigate and secure the systems, is there ways that they can circumvent and come back into the environment? What type of data did they take? How did they take the data out? The timeline and the evidence is remaining. So that's the questions that I've got and that I've been tasked with to discover and find out and report back to the business. So let's get into the hacker side. Let's go in and take you through what really happened. So let's follow the attack path and go through this scenario. So the first thing for me is finding patient 0. This is where that first machine that was a victim on the network. And it was an interesting method that I used for this, where when I did basically the log correlation, I actually looked at basically the time of the delete log event and traced that back to the first time that was run. And that was the way that I was able to find back to the initial machine where they actually launched the ransomware from, and that was actually from patient 0, which was the top of the staging environment. So we were able to find the machine. So the initial machine that was a victim was the accountant of the organization. So the accountant was that initial target. He was a person basically that was working remotely, had access to this system, was using financial systems in order to basically perform and do the audit and do the financial reporting, do the tax returns, do the invoice payments and so forth. So the accountant was the initial victim. So one of the things we found is that we wanted to understand about how did that accountant become a victim. And one of the initial areas, because we saw that the initial attack happened 7 months prior, that we're dealing with multiple attackers. The one that actually gained initial access was an access broker. And they very likely used a similar method here, which is basically password cracking hashes into clear text. And what they're able to do is they're able to mass collect large amounts of actually encrypted passwords, which is in a hash format, and then they try to understand common password choices. They look at the accountant, and they look and try to find all of their previous known password choices, and then they try to make rules that will actually find out what their future choices might be. And it was actually very easy, when I found the hash of the accountant, it was actually very easy to crack it. I did change it for this particular demo so that is not the same password the accountant used, but it was actually very, very simple. The next stage of the initial access broker is to validate that that account is actually working. And they'll use tools like Crowbar in order to take those basically cracked hashes and target them against public-facing machines of that organization. And sometimes they'll get a successful hit. And at this point in time, this is where you'll see that one successful logon attempt for that particular account. And then they might even go as far as logging on and verifying that this actually account is active and does work. At this point in time, this is where they go into the dark web, they put it up for sale for about 15 bucks. And depending on maybe the privileges of the account, it might go up maybe as far as 50. If it's a very big organization that might have a lot of resources and finances, they might even go higher. At this point in time, now the attacker has that initial access and they sell it on to another criminal. And this is the next stage. So the next stage is they also might use phishing to even go further. These are real examples of phishing. You've got a Teams message here. If you click onto the actually open in Teams, it will take you to a login prompt. You type in your credentials. You've just handed over your credentials to the criminal. Another example of a phishing campaign is password reset, is that you get a notification, your password reset. You will click on the link, take it to reset the password, and now you've simply handed over your password to the criminal to then go and do those initial access. Other great ones, one I really think is quite creative is the malicious activity. We've suspected malicious activity in your account. Is this really your information? And therefore, you should go and investigate. So now they've got initial access. I would say they've got the 1 foot in the door, and now what happens is it's been sold off to another hands-on keyboard ransomware gang. And I'll tell you some of the places where they actually made some mistakes. So in the initial access, now at this point in time, this is now the second attacker, the actually hands-on keyboard, who actually is going to deploy the actually ransomware variant, the ransomware as a service, to this organization. So the first thing that they do is they bought the credentials. They will go and typically log on similar as the actually accountant would do on a day-to-day basis. They gain access to the remote desktop. Unfortunately, this was one of the few accounts that did not have multi-factor authentication enabled, so therefore it was simply just a password protecting the system. The accountant unfortunately left an important file on the desktop called important stuff. In that file was all the passwords and usernames of the SQL database, the financial systems on the machine itself. The second mistake the accountant made was in the browser. In the browser, they were also accessing different systems, including their personal email, and they were saving all of those usernames and passwords in the password vault within the browser. And unfortunately, by default, password browsers don't enable the vault security by default. It loves cookies, it loves passwords, and unfortunately doesn't secure them. So the next stage, and this was one of the major failures that this organization made, was actually when the actual attacker did net local groups, they found out that this accountant was a local administrator for that system. And that is literally one of the most damaging things you can have. Because from local user and that local administrator, the next stage what the attacker can do is they can download their tools and they can disable security. This is the exact script the attackers used in this case. They actually had a script and everything went through and it disabled security. Now, with the security disabled, it gives them about a window of 30 minutes to do their malicious activity. Because protected services will start relaunching after 30 minutes. Sometimes, depending, it might be 15 minutes. At this point in time, they'll go and create their backdoors using sticky keys. So in case that accountant ever does change their password, they can go back at a later stage using sticky keys and very quickly create another user or change the password and gain access. Now that security is disabled, they can download more malicious software that now goes undetected because that security is not visible. They will enable a registry setting, which then allows Mimikatz to extract hashes in clear text. So after this happens, when they run it the first time, they're only going to get the accounts that they've actually initially compromised on the system. What they will do is they will then wait, maybe come back a day later, run the same tools, the same process, in the hope that at some point in time between the day, 2 days, week, that somebody with a privileged account will log on to that system. And unfortunately, this organization had a backup script running that was backing up the database, and that backup script was using a domain administrator account, very highly privileged. Interestingly, also GMER was on the system. GMER is a tool that we use in order to find rootkits. What was the attackers using it for? To look for security products that was running behind the scenes. So they were using GMER to find out what protection was in place of this organization. The next stage they did was they wanted to validate the domain administrator account that they had compromised. They will log on to the domain controller. They will validate that that credential is in fact valid, does work, and is authenticated. The next stage on the domain controller, they create another administrator user, so persistence backdoor so they can regain access just in case that account has ever had the password changed and access is restricted. At this point in time, from the victim's perspective, up until here, it was about 14 days of basically log on, and sessions that lasted between 4 minutes, and the maximum longest session was about 8 minutes long, because they were circumventing the security by disabling it and then hiding and deleting the logs. After the domain controller was logged on and the backdoors was created on the domain controller, it was 4 hours later before they went and launched the ransom on all of the systems, bringing the business to a complete standstill. So you can see here multiple mistakes made along the way. Using passwords is the only protection, not having multi-factor authentication in place, having the user being overprivileged, using a domain account to take a backup of the database on a daily basis and not rotating the password, not protecting the system with additional security controls. So there's lots of mistakes that this organization made, and they give me the permission to share this with you so that hopefully that you don't make these same mistakes, that you can learn from their lessons. The next stage is, of course, being that overprivileged user, having that local administrator, allowed them to circumvent the security. So it's really important that we move to the principle of least privilege, and we try to identify local administrator accounts where possible and restrict them and remove them to minimize these types of incidents. Also, they had some persistence of backdoors. One of the methods they used was that the backup a job itself was using PSExec. It was using connection to the actual system with the domain account, taking a backup of the database, and then closing that connection. So the attackers basically saw this, and what they decided to do was actually hide themselves within those backup jobs. So if you looked at traffic, it just looked like it was the backup jobs running. In this case, it allowed them to maintain persistence on the systems. You can see here, PSExec, give them a command prompt to the target system. So they're living off the land. They're using the same techniques that this organization used to manage their environment to try and hide behind the traffic in the scenes. Another method they were using was Windows Remote Management. What this allowed them to do was if ever the password itself was lost or they didn't get the password from their basically credential harvesting, they could use the actual hash to laterally move around the environment, another way to maintain access and persistence. What you're seeing here is what the payloads were when they actually had it hosted in the cloud environment. So the payloads here, you can see that it was a.zip. A.zip was the auto.zip files. That was the actually scripts that was used to create the backdoors, to do persistence, to change the registry keys, to disable security, to download the next payload. When you hit the download launcher in the a.zip, it downloaded b.zip. B.zip was the malicious tools such as Mimikatz in order to extract the hashes. It was the RDP tools in order to remote desktop. So there's lots of tools in here that would typically be flagged as malicious, but since they disabled security with the first one, now they were not being detected. And they would clean it up after every session, 5 minutes, clean up, hide tools, get rid of them, delete the logs, and then basically if somebody came back and looked at those logs, it would look clean. They would just have a gap of about 5 minutes in the event logs, nothing else. That's what they would see. So you can see here, once b.zip was being executed, they would move to C, D, and then when you got into the other ones here, ZAP was the actually, that was the ransomware variant itself, and they had 5 choices of different ransomware gangs that they were affiliates of, and they could have chosen either one. Why did they choose Krylock? Because the actually antivirus software they were using was not detecting Krylock. It was detecting the other 4, but not Krylock, and that's why they chose that specific variant of ransomware. So you look at what things can you do? What's the lessons you can learn from these types of identity-based attacks and the lessons learned from this organization? The first thing is you've taken the first step. The first step is coming and listening to these types of sessions about getting better educated, understanding the risks, better knowledge, cyber hygiene, understanding about mistakes that other organizations have made that you can mitigate today, that you can go and actually protect your environments. Having a ransomware-resistant backup, basically making sure that you have segregated backups that are actually offline, that are basically segregated between networks, that they don't have the same credentials. So make sure that you're not just focusing around basically fault tolerance backups, but actually backups that are not accessible from the same network as production, don't have the same credentials. So have a very strong backup. And this is actually one of the things that organizations have done great in the past year or two, is because attackers have changed their tactics, because they've had to change to data exfiltration, because organizations, they can recover maybe a couple of days, a week or two with a backup. They've actually done a very good resiliency at the backup strategy, and attackers have had to evolve to be focusing around data exfiltration now. and that's become more the primary method, is exfiltrating data and then threatening to disclose it publicly. Taking a zero trust and principal least privilege, as I showed you, this user was overprivileged. They didn't need to be a local administrator on this system. Why give it to them? Make sure you actually remove overprivileged users, because that's also what allowed them to disable security. Also, practice privileged access management. That user should not have been storing the passwords on the desktop in a clear text file. They should not have been storing it in a browser. They should have been storing it in a secure vault that was protected with additional security controls and managing it for them. If you don't get a privileged access management, make sure you got a password manager, at least. Something to allow that user to manage them much more securely so they're not storing them places that is unprotected. Application control. This is where you prevent malicious tools like Mimikatz from running, or tools that actually could potentially circumvent security. So having a strong application control method. And patching and updating security. In this system, actually, the system has also had several vulnerabilities, but the vulnerabilities had not been exploited because they were very unstable vulnerabilities. You would have seen server crashes in that case, but lucky enough, they were not actually exploited at the time. So take these practices and try to avoid becoming the next victim of a ransomware attack. Try to make sure you actually mitigate and secure identities. One of the things I do a lot of research, and I do a lot of educational papers, and what I've created for you is, and as you've seen here, a lot of privilege escalation techniques. So I've wrote a white paper that actually takes you through all of the steps that I showed you, from initial access to reconnaissance, to privilege elevation, to lateral moves, to all the possibilities of privilege escalation across Windows and Linux systems. And also in there is the mitigation techniques, how you can reduce the risk, how you can discover them, how you can identify them. So you can scan the QR code here. Hopefully you'll be able to get a copy of it. I'll leave the screen on for a minute, but this will help you understand the steps it was taking in this case and how you can make sure that when you go back to your organization, you can find which ones are easy for you to implement, take the least amount of effort, but it really makes it more difficult for the cyber attackers to be successful. So I hope this has been a final session that you've enjoyed. I hope it's been educational. If you do want to follow me, I'm the host of a very successful podcast that's on every 2 weeks. It's called the 401 Access Denied Podcast. That every 2 weeks we got amazing guests, world-renowned experts. So if you do want to, keep listening to me, subscribe to the podcast, or go and subscribe to our blog where I create these white papers. If you want to listen or talk to me, you have questions afterwards, I'll be outside at our booth. So if you have more questions, I'll be happy to answer them out there. Otherwise, stay safe, take care. It's been an awesome event. Thank you for the hospitality. Thank you for coming and listening to my session. And I look forward to seeing you again in the future. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joseph Carson, Chief Security and Scientist and Advisory CISO at Delinea. And that was a session that really illustrated to us on how attackers exploit identity and credentials as gateways, as well as the anatomy of a ransomware as a service attack. Indeed, very scary world out there. So once again, please help scan the QR code on screen to share with us your feedback and let us know how we can improve. สรุปสั้นๆนะคะก่อนที่เราจะไปถึงช่วงสุดท้ายนะคะ closing ceremony ของวันนี้ค่ะคุณโจเซฟนะคะได้เล่าให้ฟังนะคะว่าผู้โจมตีทางไซเบอร์นะคะทำงานอย่างไรบ้างนะคะโดยเล่าให้ฟังเป็นสเต็ป by สเต็ปเลยนะคะว่าเขาจะเริ่มเจาะที่ตรงไหนบ้างนะคะขั้นตอนการโจมตีเป็นอย่างไรบ้างนะคะอย่างเช่น patient zero ค่ะคือการหาdevice หรือเครื่องแรกนะคะที่เป็นตัวปัญหาหรือเป็นตัวที่โดนโจมตีก่อนนะคะว่า attacker เนี่ยเขาโจมตีที่ไหนค่ะเพื่ออาจจะหาพาสเวิร์ดนะคะหรือว่า phishing ต่างๆนะคะและนำข้อมูลเหล่านั้นไปขายใน dark web ค่ะหลังจากนั้นนะคะมีเรื่องของ initial access ค่ะ attacker ก็จะพยายามเข้า device ของเรานะคะโดยเฉพาะเครื่องที่อาจจะไม่มี MFA นะคะหรือว่าคนที่เซฟพาสเวิร์ดนะคะในเบราว์เซอร์ค่ะก็จะยิ่งทำให้การเข้าถึงเครื่อง device ต่างๆง่ายขึ้นค่ะการ disable security นะคะ using local admin นะคะรวมถึง persistent backdoor นะคะก็เป็นอีก2ขั้นตอนการโจมตีที่คุณโจเซฟได้เล่าให้เราฟังนั่นเองค่ะวิธีการป้องกันนะคะเราจะต้องฟังนะคะแล้วก็ educate ตัวเองเรื่อยๆนะคะเกี่ยวกับ cyber security threat นะคะรวมถึงพัฒนาcyber hygiene ของทุกคนให้ดีนั่นเองค่ะอีก วิธีการป้องกันหนึ่งนะคะก็คือการแบ็กอัพข้อมูลนะคะในหลายๆที่นะคะไม่ว่าจะเป็นในออฟไลน์นะคะหรือการแยกเครือข่ายแบ็กอัพนั่นเองรวมถึงการมี zero trust นะคะและ least privilege ด้วยค่ะและจะต้องมั่นใจนะคะในเรื่องของ privilege access management นะคะแล้วก็ไม่ทำเรื่องอย่างเช่นการเก็บ password อยู่ในเบราว์เซอร์นะคะซึ่งอันนั้นเป็นสิ่งที่อันตรายมากนะคะเซสชันต่อไปนะคะจะเป็น closing ceremony ค่ะ Our next session will be the closing ceremony and we will resume in a few minutes for the closing ceremony of CyberSec Asia and Thailand International Cyber Week 2025